Okay, it's setting up. 1 second. Okay. Okay, so it seems that we are live streaming now. So without further ado, let me introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is Professor Marie-Anne Vanier. She is Professor of Theology at the University of Lorraine with a double training in philosophy and theology. She's a senior member of the Academy, the Academic Institute of France, associate member of the Laboratory for Studies on Monotheism, also the director of the Rhenish Mystical Research Team, and she's published a number of different works on Meister Eckhart, books and articles, as well as St. Augustine, Cusa, Hildegard von Bingen, and others. So there's a plethora of work out there available. We're happy to hear her talk today, entitled The Dialethic Reception of Neo-Platonism by Augustine. So please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Augustine's reception of Neoplatonism is dialectic in a different way, but like that of Manichaeism, insofar as Augustine discovered the spiritual nature of God through reading the Platonic books, but also he perceived its limit, which he expressed in the metaphor of the homeland and the way. The Neoplatonist, having seen the homeland, the spiritual nature of God, but not having the way to get there, which is tragic. But in other texts, that Confessions, Augustine is not so radical and is quite close to Neoplatonism as in the first Dialogues. Using the Confession, the De Trinitate and the City of God as our primary source, and since we cannot consider the whole of Augustine's work in the space of this paper, we will try to determine what it is. First point, the dialectic reception of Neoplatonism by Augustine in the Confession. Reading the Libre Platonicorum played a decisive role in Augustine's conversion in the phase of his epistrophe. He does not specify which books he is referring to, but it is generally accepted that they are the Aeneads of Plotinus and treatises of Porphyry, in particular, the De Regressu Anime and the Philosophy of the Oracles. Reading these books helped him to move away from Manichaeism and to understand the spiritual nature of the image of God in man, that acquiesce mentis, which Master Eckhart would take up with the little spark of the soul, the Seelenfünklein. As a result of this reading, Augustine tried the Neoplatonic method of returning to the self, the famous redi in te ipsum, but the result was different from what was intended. Instead of knowing himself and coming to fusion with the One, he discovered himself as a created being in relation to his Creator, as he says in Book 7 of the Confession, text 1, and being admonished by this book to return to myself, I entered even to my inward self, thou being my guide, and able I was, for thou wert become my helper. And I entered and beheld with the eye of my soul, such as it was, above the same eye of my soul, above my mind, the light unchangeable. not this ordinary light, which all flesh may look upon, nor as it were a greater of the same kind, as though the brightness of this should be manifold brighter, and with its greatness take all space. Not such was this light, but other, yea, far other from this. Nor was it above my soul, as oil is above water, nor yet as even above earth, but above to my soul, because it made me, and below it, because I was made by it. From this experience of being created, Augustine developed his theology of creation in his 5 commentaries of Genesis. But while this experience was fundamental to Augustine's recognition of his creator, it also brought him to an awareness of his own limits. And this time, it is not so much to Neo-Platonism as to Plato that he implicitly refers with the regio dissimilitudinis. Thus he explains, text 2, thou didst beat back the weakness of my sight, streaming forth thy beams of light upon me most strongly, and I tremble with love and hope, and I perceive myself to be far off from thee, in the regio dissimilitudinis, the region of unlikeness, as I heard this thy voice from on high. I am the food of ground men, grow, and thou shalt feed upon me. Not shalt thou convert me, like the food of thy flesh, into thee, but thou shalt be converted into me. But here again, the result is different from Platonism. Augustine is undoubtedly thrown back into the regio dissimilitudinis, but when he relates his experience from the Eucharist afterwards, he is offered a way out of this regio dissimilitudinis and onto the beatific country. It is on this topic of the homeland and the way that he ends the account of his experience. A clear dividing line between Neoplatonism and Christianity emerged. Text 3. He says that he might discern and distinguish between presumption and confession, between those who saw whither they were to go, yet saw not the way, and the way that led none to behold only, but to dwell in the beatific country. The Platonic book presents not the image of this piety, the tears of confession, thy sacrifice, a troubled spirit, broken and a contrite heart, the salvation of the people, the bridal city, the earnest of the Holy Ghost, the cup of redemption. Augustine recognized the value of Neoplatonism in finding the homeland, but because of its failure to embrace humility and suffering, it does not find the way, which is the humble Christ. He takes up the question in the Dolbo Sermon 26. However, in Book 10 of the Confession of the City of God, he recognized that ignorance of the way is nevertheless a Porphyrian theme. And what Porphyry had an intuition of the homeland and a certain idea of the Trinity, even if he rather is rather on the side of Tritheism, which induces again an ambivalent attitude of Augustine towards Neoplatonism. Then, in a kind of counterproof of this experience, we find in the vision of Ostia, also called the Plotinian ecstasy atom, the same dialectic attitude toward Neoplatonism. It is in fact an ascent gradatim by degrees that he achieves with his mother Monica. But instead of coming to the expected fusion with the One, he discovers eternity. Thus, he writes in Book 9 of the Confession, text 4, we raising up ourselves with a more glowing affection towards the self's theme, did by degrees pass through all things bodily, even the very heaven, when sun and moon and stars shine upon the earth. Yet we are soaring higher yet by inward musing and discourse and unmarring of thy work. And we came to our own minds and went beyond them, that we might arrive at the region of never-failing plenty, where thou feedest Israel forever with the food of trust, and where life is the wisdom by whom all things are made, and what have been and what shall be, and she is not made, but is as he has been, and so shall be ever. Ye rather to have been, and hereafter to be, are not in her, but only to be, seeing she is eternal. For to have been and to be hereafter are not eternal. And while we were discussing and panting after her, we slightly touch on her with the whole effort of our heart, and we sighed, and there we leave bound the first fruit of the Spirit, and return to vocal expression of our most, where the word spoken as beginning and end. And what is like unto thy word, O Lord, who entered in himself without becoming old, and make all things new. As we too stand towards, and in a swift thought touch on that eternal wisdom which abate all, could this be continued on, an other vision of the kind far unlike be withdrawn, and this one ravish and absent, and wrap its beholder amid this choice, so that life might be forever, like that one moment of understanding. It is the eternity which now we sight after. It was an intuition of eternity that he had, which led then him to develop his reflection of time on time in Confession 7. Here too, the Aeneid 3:7 on time and eternity must have served him in the rereading of the vision of Ostia. But the fact remains that he understood then the meaning of eternity, and that he had a linear conception of time which was not found in Plotinus. No doubt, the Confession have an existential dimension that alters the reception of Neoplatonism by the Bishop of Hippo. But the fact remains that Augustine's spiritual experience is of a different nature from the result expected by Neoplatonism, both in terms of the return to the self and the gradatim ascent. It seems, therefore, that Neoplatonism had essentially a propedeutic and methodological function for him. We shall now see what this means in two other of his works, the De Trinitate and the City of God. And first of all, in the De Trinitate, where he applies the Porphyrian triads to the soul to show that it is created at the image of God. Second point, so, as Augustine repeats, the De Trinitate was the most difficult work for him because it was difficult for him to understand the Trinity. In order to account for this, he started from the two books of Scripture and creation. And in the latter, in the book of creation, he referred to Neo-Platonic analogies to explain how the soul is created in the image of the Trinity. The so-called psychological analogies. However, he never speaks of triads, and when he uses Porphyrian terms, esse, vivere, intelligere, for example, he applies them to the soul insofar as it is created at the image of the Trinity, which is not what Porphyry was saying, but what Marius Victorinus, a Neo-Platonist, who converted to Christianity a little before Augustine, proposed. More radically, with Augustine, not only the cogito, the I think, but also the I want, I love, I desire, are born. The general patterns of Neoplatonism that can be discerned in the Augustinian triads undergo a kind of metamorphosis. They remain in the structure of the Augustinian self, but everything is crystallized according to new laws. On the other hand, in place of the direct knowledge of being, there appears the analogical knowledge of God in the soul made in his image. One might add the notion of image is also transformed in Augustine. It is mirror and enigma, a means of imperfect knowledge, but one that cannot be surpassed in his life. Through Ambrose of Milan, Augustine discovered the spiritual nature of the image of God in man. Already in the De Genesi contra Manichaeos, he developed this notion of the image of God in man and emphasized its Trinitarian dimension. When a few years later, he was led to reflect on the Trinity, he endeavored to show that the soul, in its unity and in the correlation of its faculty, memory, intelligence, will, or spirit, knowledge, love, and so on, are an expression of the Trinity. However, there is not so much a difference in degrees as in nature between the Trinity and the soul. Indeed, the three persons are one essence, whereas each man is, on the contrary, one person, said Augustine in De Trinitate 15. On the other hand, the faculties, memory, intelligence, will, complement each other in the process of knowledge, whereas each person of the Trinity is autonomous. Text 5. There is again a wide difference in this point, likewise, that whether we speak of the mind in a man and of its knowledge and love, but in that Trinity, who would dare to say that the Father understands neither himself, nor the Son, nor the Holy Spirit, except by the Son, or loves them except by the Holy Spirit, and that he remembers only by himself, either himself or the Son or the Holy Spirit. The Trinity exceeds the trace it has left in us. Moreover, text 6, the Trinity of the soul, then, of the mind, is not therefore the image of God, because the mind remembers itself and understands and loves itself, but because it can also remember, understand, and love him. Excuse me, the cat comes. And love him by whom it was made. This image of the Trinity in the soul is therefore not static, but dynamic. It is only achieved in the relation with the Creator, a relationship which constitutes for it a kind of continuous creation. Augustine emphasized this dynamic of the image, which leads to its renewal, and he gives an account of this time moving away from Neo-Platonism. Now we can see the city of God, so third point. His great synthesis, the city of God, is not so far removed from the confession as one might have thought, as Pierre Courcelle points out, explaining that the great apologetic effort of the city of God consists, if I am not mistaken, in meditating on the process of Augustine's own conversion in order to lead Porphyry's disciples toward Christianity. As André Mondouze said, the convert of Milan became the converter of Hippo, and even more, the converter of the ancient world of the Neo-Platonists, whom he sought to bring to Christianity. There is in the city of God an apologetic view that is very important. To do this, he meets them on their own ground. He begins by recognizing the value of Plato and the Neoplatonists in Book 8 of the City of God, chapters 4 to 12. For him, one of their fundamental achievements is the tripartition of the philosophy. Thus, he writes, text 7, for those who were praised as having most closely followed Plato, who is justly preferred to all the other philosophers of the Gentiles, and were said to have manifested the greatest acuteness in understanding him, do perhaps entertain such an idea of God as to admit that in him are to be found the cause of existence, the ultimate reason for understanding, and the end in reference to which the whole life is to be regulated, of which three things. The first is undertone, to pertain to the natural, the second to the rational, and the third to the moral part of philosophy. This tripartition of philosophy is taken up again and again in Augustine's work, as can be seen For example, in letter 135 to Volusianus, in order to give an account of it, we shall confine ourselves to the city of God, where Augustine speaks of it at length. First of all, he makes it clear that as regards the first point, physics, the cause by which the universe has been constituted, and the light by which truth is to be discovered, and the fountain at which felicity is to be drunk, this is the natural revelation of the knowledge of God through creation, as said in Romans 1:90. He adds that the Platonists have understood from this unchangeableness and this simplicity that all things must have been made by him, and that he could himself have been made by none. On the second point, logic, there is also a basic convergence in that the light of our understanding, by which all things are learned by us, they have affirmed to be that self-same God by whom all things were made. As for the third point, there is also an identity of perspective, because philosophy tends towards the blessed life. It is in enjoying God that he who loves God will find his happiness. More generally, Augustine explains, it is text 8, perhaps you can show it. Thank you very much. Whatever philosophers, therefore, thought concerning the supreme God, that he is both the maker of all created things, the light by which things are known, and the good in reference to which things are to be done, that we have in the first principle of nature, the truth of doctrine, and the happiness of life. Whether this philosopher may be more suitable called Platonist, we prefer these to all philosophers and confess that they approach nearest to us. So with this tripartition of philosophy, he says that Platonists are the best philosopher. Platonists, Plato, and Neo-Platonists. Despite this convergence of view, Augustine challenged the polytheism of the Platonists and their demonology, thus establishing a dividing line. Always he is near Neo-Platonist and he goes away. But Augustine doesn't reject the ancient tripartition of philosophy. On the contrary, he takes up the question again in Book 11 of the City of God. This time, he differentiates more clearly from Neo-Platonism, in that he locates the origin of this tripartition of philosophy in the Trinity. Thus he writes, text 9, as far as one can judge, it is for the same reason that philosophers have aimed at a threefold division of science, or rather were enabled to see that there was a threefold division. For they didn't invent, but only discovered it, of which one part is called physical, another logical, the third ethical. The Latin equivalent of the names are not all naturalized in the writing of many authors, so that these divisions are called natural, rational, and moral, on which I have touched slightly in the 8th book. Not what I would conclude, that these philosophers, in this threefold division, had any thought of a trinity in God. Also, Plato is said to have been the first to discover and promulgate this distribution, and he saw that God alone could be the author of nature, the bestower of intelligence, and the kindler of love, by which life becomes good and blessed. It is clear from these few lines that Augustine's attitude is ambivalent, in that he would almost be prepared to say that Plato might have had an intuition of the Trinity, what is very important, which made Pierre Hadot say, if God can be the common object of physics, logic, and ethics, it is because he is Trinity. Platonism glimpses the property of the three divine persons. Physics discovers the Father, the cause of being. Logic reveals the Son, truth, and intelligence. Ethics turns to the order and love of the Holy Spirit. But this is more like the reinterpretation given by Augustine, who emphasized that the history of the Holy City is understood as the place where the Trinity is revealed, but also by the same token as the fulfillment of philosophy. The story thus confirms that Christianity is the true philosophy, the true religion. How can we situate Platonism? Did it have a propedeutic function? Augustine leaves the question open. He compares Platonism and Christianity and shows their similarity. Christ achieves the Platonic ideal. He who is wisdom incarnate fulfills the three parts of philosophy: ethics, physics, and logic. When he dealt with happiness in Book 10 of the City of God, as in letter 118, he again turned to the Platonists, as he said in the opening of the book, text 10. For we made selection of the Platonists, justly esteem the noblest of the philosophers, because they had the wit to perceive that the human soul, immortal and rational, or intellectual as it, cannot be happy except by partaking of the light of that God by whom both itself and the world were made, and also that the happy life which all men desire cannot be reached by any who doesn't cleave with a pure and holy love to that one supreme good, the unchangeable God. The contribution of the Platonists is twofold. Not only do they recognize the immortality of the soul, but they also explain that it finds its happiness only in its relationship with its creator. No doubt, Augustine extrapolates a little, for in other works, he makes it clear that the Platonists do not recognize creation. Moreover, he immediately challenged them by saying that in accommodating to the folly and ignorance of the people, supposed or allowed others to suppose that many gods should be worshipped. As Gulven Madec has pointed out, there is an intolerable contradiction between the theory that conceives God as bonum beatificum for every spiritual creature, man and angel, and the practice of polytheism, the diversion of worship to inferior gods who can only be demons, the deceitful demons of which Porphyry himself spoke, and of which he was a victim. For this part, Augustine, once more, rejects any kind of theology. He is interested in true salvation given by the mediator. Here again, there is a dialectic attitude, for he recalls in Book 10 of the City of God, as in letters 235 and 34 and 35 to the Porphyrian Longinus, that towards the end of the third book of the Return of the Soul, Porphyry declares that the doctrine which proposed the universal way of the soul's deliverance has not yet become the teaching of any sect, nor of the truest philosophy, nor of the moral disciplines of the Indian, nor of the initiation of the Chaldean, nor of any other school, that finally this same path has not been brought to his knowledge by history. What Augustine immediately comments on is this: as to Porphyry's statement that the universal ways of the soul deliverance had not yet come to his knowledge by acquaintance he had with history, I would ask what more remarkable history can be found than that which has taken possession of the whole world by this authoritative voice. Augustine makes this confession of Porphyry the climax of his work. It is indeed the highest point to which the pagans have reached in their search for salvation. It is at the same time what can open them to recognize in Christ the universal way of salvation, which they have hoped for but vainly sought in history, which leads Augustine to say, text 11, "Here it is, I say, the universal way for deliverance of believer, concerning which the faithful Abraham receives the divine assurance, in your seed shall all nations be blessed. He indeed was by birth a Chaldean, but that he might receive the great promise, and that there might be procreated from here a seed disposed by angels in the hand of a mediator, in whom this universal way, thrown open to all nations for the deliverance of the soul, might be found. He was ordered to leave his country and kingdom and father's home. Then was he himself, first of all, delivered from the Chaldean superstition, and by his obedience worshipped the one true God, whose promise he faithfully trusted. And hence, when our Savior, so long after, had taken flesh of the seed of Abraham, he says of himself, I am the way, the truth, and the life. This is the universal way, of which so long before it had been predicted. This way, therefore, is not the property of one, but of all nations. The law and the word of the Lord didn't remain in Zion, Jerusalem, but issued then to be universally diffused. This is the universal way of the soul's deliverance, which the holy angels and the holy prophets. In some way, this is a mastery, reworking of the theme of the homeland and the way that Augustine achieves here after having discovered it during his conversion. In the City of God, Augustine takes up the question of the homeland, but from a different perspective to the confession, in that he equates it with the heavenly Jerusalem. It appears then as an archetype, which has led some commentators to find a Platonic dimension in it. In fact, the heavenly Jerusalem is not the ideal city as described by Plato in book 878 of the Republic. It is not characterized by three different classes of citizenship. It doesn't need warriors to defend it, for it enjoys endless peace. Its citizens are those for whom God is all in all. To better understand the originality of Augustine's perspective, we would also have to take up his entire rereading of the Old Testament, where figures play an important role, as they do in Revelation 21, as well as the method of exegesis, mainly allegorical, that he used to account for it. But we cannot do it in the space of this paper. However, the term heavenly Jerusalem, Jerusalem Caelestis, soon became for Augustine the equivalent of the heavenly city, the city of God, the church in its very nature, and not the present church, which is still permixed up, mingled, made up of righteous and sinner, peregrinants on the way to its full realization, precisely in the heavenly Jerusalem. This one might say is a definite point of rupture with Neo-Platonism. Augustine moves from a philosophical to an ecclesiological vision, while Neo-Platonism enabled him to understand the spiritual nature of God. It spoke to him of the all other God, whereas through his personal encounter with Christ, Augustine discovered that God is Trinity and that Christ, through his dual divine and human nature, introduced him into the very life of the Trinity. This is more than Platonic mimesis. Indeed, it is beyond compare. The earthly church is not a copy or reflection of the heavenly church. On the contrary, the church was born in the Jerusalem of the earth in order to dwell in the heavenly Jerusalem. She will be completely in the Jerusalem of heaven, but it was in the Jerusalem of earth that she began. The present church prepares the future church, the heavenly Jerusalem, which will be characterized by the vision of God, by the fulfillment of divine sonship. Augustine experienced this, but if this experience is already given in this life, the full achievements comes after the passage of the resurrection, which conforms to Christ, introduces to the Trinitarian life and gives the opportunity to go from figures to reality. Conclusion: from these few examples, we can see that Augustine is strongly influenced by Neo-Platonism, and that he rethinks it in order to highlight the originality of Christianism. But for him, there is always a reflection that is Neoplatonist and a reinterpretation. So the dialectic attitude of Augustine. I thank you.
Thank you.
Excuse my bad English.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very clear, very interesting. So if there are any questions that come up on YouTube, we will transfer those to you. We have a little bit of time for questions and discussion. Maybe I will start off. I have a question. I really enjoyed your discussion of Augustine and the way that he is influenced by Neoplatonism, and also how he is distinguishing himself from them and interacting with them. It's very nuanced and helpful. In the previous talk by Eric Pearl, he also spoke about some ways that Augustine is distinct from the kind of Neoplatonic heritage as well. I wanted to ask you something about something you said early on, that's the Augustinian attitude towards the homeland in connection with the Neoplatonic understanding, that with the Neoplatonic, they found the homeland, but not the way. So they don't have Christ. So, and in part because they lack humility. And I'm thinking also about, I'm curious if you could elaborate more on this. I'm especially interested in the idea of theosis in the Christian Neoplatonic tradition. This idea of divinization that you see, with Pseudo-Dionysius and others later on. And I'm curious if you think this would also count as a lack of humility from the Augustinian point of view. So I was hoping that you could connect Augustine's critique of the Neoplatonists and connect this with questions about theosis, or I hope that is clear enough what I'm asking.
I think that there is an evolution of Augustine, because in the Confession, he stresses the importance of humility, of the way, but in the City of God, it's somewhat different, because he tells that Porphyr is the first one who stresses the importance of the way, but it is not clear for him. He does not know exactly what is the way, but it is a different attitude, because Porphyry has understood the importance of the way. And I didn't develop the importance of divinization, because it is an important point in Augustine. Not much work, but for example, Henry Chadwick showed the importance of divinization. I told about sonship, but I could develop also divinization. And here, what is interesting also is the relationship between Master Eckhart and Augustine, because Eckhart understood very well Augustine, and afterwards took also his own way.
That's interesting. I was, could you elaborate briefly a little bit on the the influence between Augustine and Eckhart on this last point that you mentioned? This is something that I'd like to understand better, explore more. So
Yes.
a big, I know that it's a lot, but if you briefly point at some
Yes.
influence, that would be helpful. Sorry, I know it's too big of a question.
Yes, for Eckhart, I think the homeland is less important because for Augustine, it was a discovery, the spiritual nature of God. And for Eckhart, it's not a problem, but the difference, the analogy is the way. The way, it's also humility, the discovery of humility. But for Eckhart, it's not only an attitude, but it is almost ontological. It's the humble man. The noble man is the humble man. And it is a way of life. And it is not perhaps the way to follow Christ, but the way to be one with Christ. It's there is a transformation. It goes further than Augustine on this point.
So yeah, Eckhart certainly goes farther than Augustine on this point, to become one with Christ rather than just follow. Yeah, to be the one and only begotten Son, without any difference, as Eckhart would say. Yes, exactly. So let me just check YouTube, but if there's no questions there, or if Paula doesn't have a question, then I will continue to ask some more questions. Okay, I'm interested in this point you made about the church at the end, about the earthly church and what its work is. And it's not just an image or something, but it's somehow preparing for a future church of some kind. I'm interested in the temporality of the church here, and how this may be a deviation from Neoplatonic understanding of time. Do you have any comments or insights on this, the temporality of the church and Augustine's relation to Neoplatonism?
I think that at the end of the City of God, it is an apologetical attitude that Augustine has, and it was also to explain what is the City of God. And it is not an earthly city, it is not political Augustinism, but it's the heavenly city. So is the church, but not the church of today, per mixta, but a church who gives happiness to all. It's different, and it's also the unity. And perhaps there is a parallel between the unity of the person, of the man in the confession, and the unity of all people in the City of God.
But could you say something more about the relation of the earthly church to the to this heavenly community?
Yes, it's also the relationship between time and eternity, because he discovered in the confession this relationship, and today the earthly church as already a part of the heavenly church. The eternity is already present but not entirely, just a part. And it will progress, and then it's more greater.
I see. That's helpful. Thank you. Any other
Sorry,
questions?
yes, I was trying to. No, I was wondering. It's the same concept of the last book of Confessions, right? The same concept of church, the one you are speaking about.
I was speaking about the last book of the City of God, not of the Confession.
I know, but I made the connection with the last book of Confessions, where the church seems to be the theme.
Yes, but in the City of God, it goes further, I think. It was the first idea in the Confession, but in the City of God, it's somewhat for greater.
Yeah. Thank you.
Maybe I'll ask one final question if there's nothing coming in from YouTube here. I was interested in this quote about the truth being universally diffused. I think that was the translation, this universal diffusion. And so I'm wondering if this is already an implication that, look, in a way, the truth is universally diffused to the Neoplatonists, and there's going to be some truth in it. It's not all going to be bad, and we'll be able to develop certain dimensions of it. Is this also a way into, in a way, appropriating and developing ideas from Neoplatonism by seeing the truth to be universally diffused, or are these unconnected ideas?
Yes, I think that it started from Neo-Platonism for this idea, and then he extended it to all, but it is the root is Neo-Platonism, and I think also that is a writer, so he repeats the universal way and so on. He stresses this point, but the origin is in Neoplatonism.
Okay, well, thank you so much. If we don't have any more questions, maybe we can finish here. So thank you once more for coming and for presenting to us.
Thank you very much.
Yes, and I hope it's okay that this lecture will stay on YouTube. That's okay. And others can enjoy it in the future when they have time. And yeah, I hope we will take a very brief break, and at 2:15 we'll have our last talk of the day by Douglas Headley from Cambridge. So
thank you very much.
Thank you very much. See you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we'll meet back in 15 minutes.
Yes, excuse my English. It's a problem.
No, it was actually quite clear, and I was able to follow mostly everything. So please, no apologies. It was very good. I have lots of notes, as you can see. Yeah,
it was very interesting. I keep the video off because it's 3 o'clock in the morning here in Buenos Aires. know, I'm sort of falling apart.
Paula, this is very impressive. I'm very impressed by your fortitude. I know this is an Augustinian virtue, fortitude. So
I took a nap in the 2-hour break.
oh, good. That's
Yes,
very
well,
impressive.
it's a problem because here it's 7 o'clock. It's 12, but the beginning it's 1 o'clock in the night.
Yes, it's very difficult when you have
Yes, with the time.
speakers from the East Coast of the United States, and then
Yes,
England, and then Hong Kong. It's
yes,
very difficult. So hopefully some people will be able to attend.
many hours of difference. Night for the one, day for the other.
Exactly. But the good thing is, good to see you, Douglas, that that these will be on YouTube. So the viewership will be much greater than the number of
Yes.
people on Zoom at any moment. So even if we have small numbers here, hopefully many people will be able to learn about Eckhart,
Yes.
Neoplatonism for months to come, you know, and
Yeah.
you'll be receiving some queries and messages about these
Yes.
things. Yeah.
Yes, it's very well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How are you, Douglas?
I've just woken up.
Okay.
Really. So,
Thank you for getting up early.
6 o'clock. Yeah.
Any lapses in memory, or anything is fully excused because of this ungodly hour of the divine. So, okay, so we'll start back in about 15 minutes. I'm going to get a cup of tea.
Okay.
And I'll be back. Okay? All right. Okay, so I hope it's all right if we go ahead and get started. Let me go ahead and introduce our next speaker for the morning, the afternoon, or the evening, depending on where you are in the world. So our next speaker is Professor Douglas Headley from the Faculty of Divinity, the University of Cambridge. He studied in Oxford and Munich. He works on contemporary philosophy of religion, Platonism, Neo-Platonism, Romanticism, and the Cambridge Platonists. He's written a triad of books on the imagination that are on my reading list, as well as a book by Coleridge. He is the director of the Cambridge Center for the Study of Platonism and is currently running a grant. He's the principal investigator on the AHRC grant, The Cambridge Platonists at the Origins of Enlightenment, Text, Debates, and Reception, 1650 to 1730. And today we're going to hear a talk entitled Harbingers of Romanticism, ? The Legacy of the Cambridge Platonists. So thank you very much, Professor Headley, for accepting my invitation and for talking to us today.
Well, thank you very much, Gregory. If I may say, actually the grant finished in 2019, but it is online, so there is a Cambridge Platonist source book which anybody can access. And on top of that, there will be a anthology of the Cambridge Platonists coming up with Routledge that I'm editing with Christian Hengstemann. So basically, I'm going to talk today about the legacy of the Cambridge Platonists and about their significance for the Romantic and idealist movement. So I'll summarize what I'm going to say very briefly now and explain why some of the details that I will be discussing, I think, are really rather significant. Because what I'm wanting to claim is that the Cambridge Platonists are the key link between the Renaissance and Renaissance Platonism and the revival of Platonism that we find undoubtedly in the Romantic period, and particularly in German idealism and German Romanticism. And I'll give you just two examples of that. First of all is the fact that Hen Kai Pan, so the slogan that was taken for the as the sort of battle cry of Spinocism in the German pantheism controversy, that was taken from Lorenz von Mosheim's Latin translation of Cudworth's True Intellectual System. So that is one instance of the this sort of longue durée influence of the Cambridge Platonists through the 18th century. And the other is a reference in those letters of Jacobi about his discussions with Spinoza that was at the center of the pantheism controversy. He actually quotes Heinrich Mohr and in relation to Kabbalism, and Heinrich Mohr, of course, is Henry Mohr. So there is a legacy here, which is, I think, intellectually very significant and has been overlooked. So let me start off. So the eminent German philosopher Ernst Cassirer viewed the Cambridge Platonists as anti-moderns and came to the conclusion that their legacy was limited to aesthetics, especially through the influence of Shaftesbury. Now, this is an intriguing instance of a false but influential assessment. Now, we shall note that Cassirer is correct in what he affirms, but incorrect in what he denies. The influence upon aesthetics via Shaftesbury is indeed part of the bequeathal of the Cambridge Platonists, especially through the reception of Shaftesbury in Germany. But this is just one of many areas in which their influence has been felt. The illustrious Victorian Unitarian James Martineau's Types of Ethical Theory contains a fine chapter on Cudworth. It begins in a most memorable fashion. He writes, "There is a singular contrast between the calm contemplative philosophy of Cudworth and the fierce contentions of his time. Born in a country rectory, a la Somerset, in 1617, the year of Raleigh's execution, and dying in 1688, the year of James II's abdication, he spans, by his term of life, the whole period of the Stuart troubles and the Commonwealth, yet his writings might have been produced in a lonely and silent monastery, instead of amid the rage of factions and reverberations of the Naseby guns." So Naseby was a crucial battle in the English Civil War. It is thoroughly misleading to overlook the profound influence of the Cambridge Platonists on the development of ethics in Britain. One obvious impact of their thought is over the key problem of moral certainty. The Scottish sentimentalists, Francis Hutcheson, David Hume, and Adam Smith, were familiar with the Cambridge Platonists, even if explicit references to the Platonists in their work are rather fleeting. It's clear, however, that the influence of the Cambridge figures on these North Britons was marked. Ralph Cudworth is explicitly mentioned by Hume in his inquiry concerning the principles of morals in 1764 in relation to the abstract theory of morals, that's in the inquiry, and the radical Richard Price's review of principal questions in morals exhibits the influence of Cudworth's Eternal and Immutable Morality, posthumously published in 1731. So the fact that Cudworth's works were published like this one in the 18th century meant that there was a, as it were, a deferred influence. Nor was the legacy limited to the 18th century debates about moral certainty. The Cambridge Platonists informed the discussions about reasons and sentiments in ethics more generally. In 1897, Selby Bigg produced his influential anthology, The British Moralists, which quite rightly included Cudworth as one of the pivotal ethicists of the early modern period. And since then, historians of philosophy have disputed whether Selby Bigg was correct to place Cudworth among the moral rationalists rather than the sentimentalists. And more recently, Stephen Darwell, in his book, The British Moralists and the Internal Ought, 1640 to 1740, has argued that Cudworth represents an important stage in the development of modern ethics, culminating in Kant's theory of autonomy. So ethics is one area where they undoubtedly had a very significant influence. The second topic is that of nature. So I'm just going to quote a few lines from Pope in his Essay on Man, lines 7 to 15. "Look round our world, behold the chain of love, combining all below and all above. See plastic nature working to this end. The single atoms each to other tend. Attracted to, the next in place, formed and impelled its nature to embrace. See matter next, with various life endued. Press to one center still the general good. See dying vegetables life sustain. See life dissolving vegetate again. All forms that perish, other forms supply. By turns we catch the vital breath and die. Like bubbles on the sea of matter born, they rise, they break, and to that sea return. Now, Pope's lines are a fine exhibit of the influence of the Cambridge Platonists on the 18th century's view of nature. The Cambridge Platonists opposed both the mechanists and certain vitalists. Cudworth clearly viewed philosophers such as Francis Glisson. So Glisson was a vitalist who saw matter as sort of innately vitalistic. So this is Glisson's Tractatus de Natura Substantiae Energetica as confederates of Spinoza. And in Pope's line, we find Cudworth's preferred alternative, namely a Platonic atomism with a teleological conception of the universe that is bound by the chain of love. The presence of this notion here and Cudworth's notion of plastic nature is not an example of an arcane interest in Platonism, but of ideas firmly entrenched in 18th century thought. John Ray, 1627 to 1705, was perhaps the most important biologist before Linnaeus and the first to produce a biological definition of a species. He was a student of Whichcote, Cudworth, and Moore. In 1691, Ray produced his work, The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation, which attempted to follow Cudworth and Moore in opting for a middle way between a crudely anthropomorphic model of creation as a unique divine initiative and the reductionistic, mechanistic model of the Cartesians. You can find this in Charles Raven's Natural Religion and Christian Theology in Cambridge. Nehemiah Grew, sometimes dubbed the father of plant anatomy, was less clearly dependent upon Cudworth, but the distinguished author of the catalogue of the Museum of the Royal Society and of Cosmologia Sacra was very much in the wake of the Cambridge Platonists. And there's a very interesting book by a fellow called Bonfazzi called The Soul of the World, which discusses this. Anthony Ashley Cooper, the third Earl of Shaftesbury, 1671 to 1713, Lord Ashley from January of 1683, was close to Cudworth's daughter, Lady Masham, and John Locke. And Shaftesbury's major work, Characteristics of Men, Manners, Opinions, and Times, was one of the most influential English works of the 18th century and frequently reprinted. But he was also the main conduit of the intellectual heritage of the Cambridge Platonists. In 1698, he published the first edition of the Sermons of Dr. Whichcote, in which he himself wrote the preface. In The Moralists, a philosophical rhapsody published in 1709, he writes of Cudworth as that pious and learned man. That's in The Moralist 2:3. The Moralist is a dialogue narrated from the perspective of Philocles, a skeptic who engages with the rhapsodic Theocles about the search of happiness and the good. Theocles repeatedly uses the word system, a distinctively Cudworthian term. The great work of Cudworth is the true intellectual system of the universe. And he stresses that the world ought to be viewed as such, i.e. that all things in this world are united. Careful observation of nature reveals that all is fitted and joined together, each thing contributing to the, quote, order, union, and coherence of the whole. Shaftesbury's Platonic Stoic insistence upon the order and beauty of the cosmos is a striking instance of his proximity to Cudworth and indeed his debt. On the continent, Cudworth's thought was influentially received by the Amsterdam theologian, philosopher, and editor Jean Leclerc. Jean Leclerc was a Huguenot who was so a French emigre working in Amsterdam. A cosmopolitan figure, Leclerc corresponded with Cudworth in his lifetime, as well as Leibniz, Shaftesbury, and Locke. Leclerc's great legacy were his Bibliothèque universelle et historique, which he began with Delacroze, the Bibliothèque choisie, and the Bibliothèque ancienne et moderne. Volume 6 and 7 of the Bibliothèque choisie contain a positive account of Cudworth's thought, which included the Cambridge Platonist categorization of Spinoza's philosophy, especially his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, as a revival of hylozoic or stratonical atheism. So for Cudworth, Stratonism is the view that matter is the sole substance of an animated cosmos, lacking any transcendent rational principle. In his Bibliothèque choisie, Leclerc also presented parts of Cudworth's theory of plastic nature. Cudworth, like More, admired the theism of Descartes and his emphasis upon the centrality and irreducibility of mind or spirit, but he worried about the radical dualism of mind and matter in Descartes. Cudworth, like More and other contemporaries, such as Baxter and Casaubon, began to turn metaphysically against Cartesianism and the anti-teleology of the Galilean program more generally as de facto atheism that concluded with Epicurean materialism. Plastic nature was the term that Cudworth used for the intermediary between the divine mind and the world of nature, an unconscious spirit that is responsible for and explains order and purpose in the physical world, in essence a version of the Platonic anima mundi. Leclerc's propagation of the idea generated a celebrated dispute between Leclerc and Pierre Bayle, who replied to Leclerc with his Continuation des pensées diverses sur les comètes, averring that this vision of an animated nature unwittingly supported the atheist position. The debate continued with Leclerc replying again in the Bibliothèque choisie and Bayle in the Ouvrage des Savants. So that's part of this reception in the 18th century that was immensely important throughout Europe and indeed particularly in Germany. So now you wouldn't perhaps expect the British empiricists to be particularly influenced by the Cambridge Platonists, but again, that's not the case. So there's a textbook contrast between Cartesian rationalism and British empiricism. Cudworth, however, viewed the key debate in his age in rather different terms. So this is a quote from Cudworth. Wherefore the same Plato tells us that there had been always, as well as there was, a perpetual war and controversy in the world, and as he calls it, a kind of gigantomachy, betwixt these two parties or sects of men, the one that held there was no other substance in the world beside body, the other that asserted incorporeal substance. That's from the True Intellectual System, 1678, page 18. The tradition of identifying the British empiricists as Locke, Berkeley, Hume tends to occlude or diminish the strong links between all three figures and the Cambridge Platonists. Cudworth's passage about Plato might well be employed to describe 17th and early 18th century British philosophy. Hobbes constitutes the materialist rage for reduction to body, whereas Cudworth and More stand for the critique of the naturalist and atheist vision in favor of incorporeal substance. And from this perspective, Locke and Berkeley are successors of the Cambridge Platonists, while Hume is the follower of Hobbes. The 17th century was particularly fertile for the philosophy of religion. Descartes constructed his so-called trademark argument in the third meditation and fashions a version of the infamous ontological argument in the fifth. But More's Enchiridion Metaphysicum, Henry More's Enchiridion Metaphysicum, I should say, argued that Descartes blocks the traditional arguments for God, emphasizing the rejection of final causes and pointing out Descartes' excessive reliance upon the ontological argument. Cudworth's two intellectual system provided a monumental taxonomy and critique of atheism and fatalism. The interest of More and Cudworth in natural philosophy was closely linked to a concern with the question of freedom and responsibility. The radical empiricism, materialism of Hobbes was combined with a doctrine of the state that the Platonists found deeply uncongenial. Metaphysical and ethical questions assumed enormous political importance during the turbulent Civil War period. Again, Cudworth's contribution is of great significance in this respect. Sarah Hutton makes a convincing case for the influence of Cudworth upon Hume in the wording of the dialogues concerning natural religion, and certainly the natural history of religion. In Hume's classic dialogues, there are various reverberations of Cudworth, not least in language, when, for example, Hume refers to archetypes and ectypes. Most of chapter 4 of the True Intellectual System is devoted to the priority of monotheism, drawing upon Vossius's Origins of Gentile Theology and his own extensive knowledge of antique sources. Cudworth endeavors to show that monotheism was generally accepted among pagan theologians, insisting that it was universally agreed among them that the world and inferior gods, however supposed by some to have existed from eternity, yet were nevertheless all derived from one sole, self-existent deity as their cause. That's the True Intellectual System, 1678, page 253. This thesis that the pagans agreed upon one supreme deity is precisely the target of Hume's Natural History of Religion and his claim that there was an oscillation between pagan monotheism and polytheism. Cudworth also provided the structure for an argument that would be rehearsed well into the 18th century when it was decisively attacked by David Hume. The argument, which can be found in chapter 4, section 2 of the True Intellectual System of the Universe, which aims to show that the presence of mind in the cosmos has to be explained by a kindred but higher principle, an eternal mind senior to the world. Hume ridiculed the argument, wondering what particular privilege has this little agitation of the brain, which we call thought, that we must make it the model of the whole universe. Cudworth's argument is based upon what he, after Lucretius and De Rerum Natura, took to be the basic principle of atheism: ex nihilo nihil fit. Out of nothing comes nothing. For Cudworth, this principle is in fact the Achilles of the atheists, their invincible argument against divine creation and omnipotence, because nothing could come from nothing, it being concluded from hence that whatsoever substantially or really is, was from all eternity of itself unmade or uncreated by any deity. If nothing comes from nothing, then there must be something eternal, something that is ultimately the cause of other things. Yet for Cudworth, here lies atheism's fatal flaw. The first cause cannot be dead or mindless eternal matter, because if it requires causes, then causes must account for their effects in every aspect. The effects of the first cause include lively, intelligent creatures, rational minds, and dead and mindless matter have not the explanatory resources to account for these as cause. So if nothing comes from nothing, and we must explain intelligence, what we require is something which itself possesses intelligence, essentially, and at a higher level, such that it can be a cause of it in other things. Thus, Cudworth believes that the principle of atheism, he can furnish, from this principle of atheism, he can furnish an argument for an eternal intelligence, i.e. for God. Hume took a low view of this argument, referring to the ex nihilo nihil fit principle as that impious maxim of ancient philosophy, ex nihilo nihil fit, by which the creation of matter was excluded, ceases to be a maxim according to this philosophy. Not only the will of the supreme being may create matter, but for aught we know, a priori, the will of any other being might create it, or any other cause that the most whimsical imagination can assign. So Hume pours scorn on the principle as he casts doubt on the laws of causality in general, and by questioning whether the theist who employs Cudworth's argument has fairly accounted for the cause of matter by appealing to an immaterial deity, he places himself with the first side in the perpetual war and controversy recounted by Cudworth in the quotation at the beginning of this section, the conflict between the partisans of corporeal and incorporeal substance, the conflict between the empiricists and the rationalists that was important in early modern philosophy. So there, basically, all I'm arguing is that even if you look at a figure like Hume, you can see ex negativo the direct influence of the Cambridge Platonists. Gregory, how long have I got?
You have until 3 o'clock, or you can go even a little longer if you'd like.
Okay, I'm fine. Then great. I was just wanting to check. So the literary legacy of the Platonists. So this is a quote from Henry Fielding, the dedication to Tom Jones. Perhaps a surprising text to quote in the context. I declare that to recommend goodness and innocence has been my sincere endeavor in this history. This is the history of the rather scurrilous history of Tom Jones, of course, in the famous novel. The honest purpose you have been pleased to think I have attained, and to say the truth, it is likeliest to be attained in books of this kind. For an example is a kind of picture in which virtue becomes, as it were, an object of sight, and strikes us with an idea of loveliness, which Plato asserts there is in her naked charms. Besides displaying that beauty of virtue which may attract the admiration of mankind, I have attempted to engage a stronger motive in human action in her favor by convincing men that their true interest directs them to a pursuit of her. Now, the influence of the Cambridge Platonists upon 18th century literature up to Wordsworth and Coleridge is complex but pervasive. More's dialogues of 1674 could readily be seen as the blueprint for 18th century dialogues on religion, such as Shaftesbury and Berkeley. Themes such as rational theology and skepticism, or innatism versus empiricism, run through the great works of 18th century and authors such as Henry Fielding or Lawrence Sterne. Indeed, there's much evidence for the presence of the Cambridge Platonists in the great literary figures of the Augustan age in Britain. This is a scholar called Battistin, who quotes the following passage from Cudworth. The evolution of the world, as Plotinus calls it, a truer poem, and we men, historical actors upon the stage, who, notwithstanding, insert something of our own into the poem too, but God Almighty is that skillful dramatist who always connecteth that of ours which went before with what of his follows after into good coherent sense, and will at last make it appear that a thread of exact justice did run through it, and that rewards and punishments are measured out in geometrical proportion. Now, Battistin is using this quotation from Cudworth to show this Plotinian model of the stage as being significant for writers who are drawing on him. Thomas Burnet was a pupil of Cudworth, following him from what was then Clare Hall, now we call it Clare College, then it was Clare Hall, to Christ's College in 1654. And he was a friend of Henry More. Burnet was the author of The Sacred Theory of the Earth of 1684. A corrected version appeared in subsequent years, and a Latin version, Telluris Theoria Sacra, was published in 1684. The work was read and admired by literary notables such as Addison, Steele, Warton, Young, and indeed was read by Blake. He was regarded as a great stylist and is quoted by Coleridge in the 1817 version of the Rime of the Ancient mariner. Now, Burnet's anonymous 1697 critique of John Locke is less renowned than his speculative cosmogony, but it addresses one of the great themes of 18th century literature, an innate moral sensibility. In the first remarks of that work, Burnet attacks John Locke's empiricism. And I'll quote a longish passage. Your general principle of picking up all our knowledge from our five senses, I confess, does not sit easily in my thoughts. As to morality, we think the great foundation of it is the distinction of good and evil, virtue and vice, turpis et honesti, as they are usually called. And I do not find that my eyes, ears, nostrils, or any other outward sense make any distinction of these things, as they do of sounds, colors, scents, or other outward objects. Nor from any ideas taken in from them, or from their reports, am I conscious that I do conclude, or can conclude, that there is such a distinction in the nature of things, or that it consists only in pleasure or pain, conveniency or inconveniency. This I am assured of, that the distinction, suppose of gratitude and ingratitude, fidelity and infidelity, justice and injustice, and such other, is as sudden, without ratiocination, and is as sensible and piercing as the difference I feel from the scent of a rose and an asafoetida. 'Tis not like a theorem which we come to know by help of precedent demonstrations and postulatums, but it rises as quick as any of our passions, or as laughter at the sight of a ridiculous accident or object. That is to say, that just as the delicious scent of a rose is as immediate as the stench of the asafoetida, so too the sight of the sense of right and wrong is as immediate and innate. It is not, Burnet insists, reliant upon some kind of ratiocination or even an appeal to divine will. Empiricism simply cannot, according to Burnet, account for moral knowledge. And in this, Burnet was followed by thinkers and writers as diverse in their views as Lord Shaftesbury and Bishop Butler. I'm going to move on now to the circle of Leibniz, the Ragley circle, and Jakob Böhme. Leibniz, one of the most potent critics of empiricism, describes his own philosophical position in relation to Lady Anne Conway and Henry More in the following terms. My feelings in philosophy are somewhat close to those of the Countess Conway, and hold a mean between Plato and Democritus, for I think that everything happens mechanically, as is held by Democritus and Descartes, against the view of Mr. More and others like him. And nevertheless, everything also happens vitally and in accordance with final causes, everything being life and perception, against the view of the Democriteans. That's a letter to another man called Burnet, who's actually not the same as the Burnet I've just been quoting. But Leibniz's self-assessment in relation to Henry More and Lady Anne Conway certainly deserves some attention. It should be viewed in relation to the astonishing and brilliant milieu at Ragley, a house which contained one of the largest private early modern libraries in England. Francis Mercury van Helmont, the son of a Flemish natural philosopher, Jan Baptist van Helmont, also stayed at Ragley, actually for many years. Van Helmont supported Lady Conway's study of the Jewish Kabbalah and introduced Conway to Quakers, such as George Fox, Robert Barclay, George Keith, and William Penn, whose religion she would finally adopt. Van Helmont introduced Christian Knorr van Rosenholt, the foremost Christian expert on the Kabbalah in the late 17th century. The collaboration of Van Helmont and von Rosenholt culminated in the publication of the hugely influential Latin Cabala Denudata in 1677. It was also through van Helmont that Leibniz became familiar with Conway's thought. Anne Conway's monistic vitalism, expressed in her The Principles of the Most Ancient and Modern Philosophy, is the product of her own considerable intellect and learning, and an enduring testimony to that remarkable milieu at Ragley. This is a country house in Warwickshire. Lady Anne Conway was the sister of one of Henry More's pupils at Christ's College, and through the brother of Conway, Henry More came to know Anne Conway and was a regular visitor at the house. Henry More referred to Anne Conway as his heroine pupil. So Leibniz's theology would go on to inspire Pierre Bayle, and Leibniz was the principal source lying behind Lessing's philosophical position. Leibniz corresponded with Lady Damaris Masham, Ralph Cudworth's daughter and a close friend of John Locke. As has been argued by Catherine Wilson, the term monad is probably derived from More or Cudworth. She writes, this is Catherine Wilson, she writes, it's impossible to talk about Leibniz's ideas concerning vital principles in nature without discussing his reception of the work of Ralph Cudworth, defender of the theory of plastic nature, which, by the way, is based almost entirely on Ennead 3.8, on nature, contemplation, and the one. For Cudworth was quite simply the most able critic of Cartesianism in the realm of a general theory of nature. Despite the proliferation there of controversies about Cartesian physics and epistemology, no one in France could claim to have mounted an attack comparable in breadth and depth to his own. Moreover, Cudworth was the single most important medium for the transmission of Platonian and Platonic intellectualism in the period, a fact of particular significance to Leibniz, who was himself one of the rare appreciators of Plato in the late 17th century. Now, so let's turn now to from Leibniz to Boehme. Hegel named Boehme the Philosophus Teutonicus, yet Boehme's reception in Germany was erratic. Boehme, however, enjoyed considerable popularity in England and the Netherlands, particularly among radical Protestant groups such as the Quakers and the Philadelphians. Rufus Jones, in his magisterial work, Spiritual Reformers in the 16th and 17th century, concentrates upon Sterry, Whichcote, and John Smith, but he fails to discuss More and the Ragley circle of Anne Conway, which was pivotal for the Quakers, who had strong links with continental pietism and Boehmism that was often mediated through van Helmont. In England, the Boehme influence was sustained throughout the 18th century by William Law, a writer of uncommon genius, bound to the Cambridge Platonists through his alma mater, Emmanuel College, as well as in many of his theological and philosophical tenets. Law was greatly admired by both S.T. Coleridge and William Blake. One might even say that Boehme, whose influence upon German Romanticism was so profound, came back to Germany via England and the Netherlands. Here, the part played by More and his reception on the continent is key. To the Republic of Letters in the 17th century, the age of nice and hot disputes, national boundaries were porous. Rosalie Colley's 1957 book, Light and Enlightenment, a study of the Cambridge Platonists and the Dutch Arminians, remains an important work here. Colley explores the links between the preeminent Protestant powers of the age and concentrates upon the Cambridge Platonists and the Dutch Arminians and their shared disputes with Orthodox Calvinism, whether of the Dutch Reformed version or the Westminster Confession. The links between the Dutch remonstrants and the Cambridge Platonists were mediated through common friends, interests, and controversies. The Dutch Arminians Philippus van Limburg was best known for his close connection with Locke, also corresponded with More and Cudworth. The Low Countries were part of the heart of controversies emanating from Descartes and Spinoza, and More in particular played a prominent role in the Dutch context among these warring Arminians as a notable anti-Spinozist. In fact, More was translated into Dutch, so Henry More's involvement in this controversy. And More offered a critique of Burma and crucially identified Spinoza as a Beemanist and as a Kabbalist, an idea which enjoyed a long afterlife in the 18th century. Leibniz, Herder, and Goethe were all deeply influenced by mystical pietism, and the role of the Cambridge Platonists and Anne Conway in this trajectory has really yet to be explored. Okay, so I'm coming to my conclusion. This is a passage from Coleridge's, Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Biographia Literaria. And I hope that in the light of what I'm saying, some of his words will probably be clearer than they might otherwise seem. He writes, "The feeling of gratitude which I cherish towards these men," he's talking about the mystics, including Burma, "has caused me to digress further than I had foreseen or proposed, but to have passed them over in a historical sketch of my literary life and opinions would have seemed to me like the denial of a debt, the concealment of a boon. For the writings of these mystics acted in no slight degree, to prevent my mind from being imprisoned within the outline of any single dogmatic system. They contributed to keep alive the heart in the head, gave me an indistinct yet stirring and working presentiment that all the products of the mere reflective faculty partook of death, and were as the rattling twigs and sprays in winter, into which a sap was yet to be propelled from some root to which I had not yet penetrated. If they were to afford my soul either food or shelter, if they were too often a moving cloud of smoke to me by day, yet they were always a pillar of fire throughout the night, during my wanderings through the wilderness of doubt, and enabled me to skirt, without crossing, the sandy deserts of utter unbelief. That the system capable of being converted into an irreligious pantheism, I well know. The ethics of Spinoza may or may not be an instance, but at no time could I believe that in itself and essentially it is incompatible with religion, natural or revealed, and now I am most thoroughly persuaded of the contrary." Now, Samuel Taylor Coleridge's memorable panegyric to the mystics who managed to keep alive the heart in the head in the Biographia Literaria is notable for its beauty and the reference to Exodus 13 and the pillar of cloud that went ahead of the Israelites by day to guide their way, and the pillar of fire by night that gave them illumination. And the image of the sandy deserts of utter unbelief, it culminates in mentioning Spinoza and the problem of pantheism. Now, the pantheism controversy, which began in 1785, when Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi reported a meeting with Lessing 5 years prior, at which Lessing had confessed his Spinocism. And Jacobi writes, "Once Lessing said to me, half joking, that perhaps he himself was the highest being, and at present in a state of utmost contraction." That, of course, is the Simsum doctrine of the Kabbalah. "I asked for my existence. He answered it was not really meant like this, and explained his point in such a fashion as reminded me of Henry More and Franciscus Mercurius van Helmont, philosophus per unum in quo omnia. Lessing explained his point with even more clarity, but in such a way I could not help suspect him of Kabbalizing once again. However, this proved of no little delight to him that I took the opportunity to plead for the Kibble, or the Kabbalah in its most proper sense, that it was impossible in and of itself to invent the infinite from the finite as it showed itself to us, then grasp their mutual relationship and express it in some kind of formula. Therefore, if one were to say anything about it, one would have to say it on the basis of revelation." Lessing continued to insist that he wished all things to be expounded to him in a natural fashion. I retorted, there could be no natural philosophy of the supernatural, even though there were clearly both, i.e. natural and supernatural things. So that's directly from the Hauptschriften zur Pantheismusstreit. So it's well known that the German idealism emerged out of the Pantheismusstreit, out of the pantheism controversy. Less well known is the role of Henry Moore in uniting the Cartesian Spinoza with Jakob Böhmer, and indeed with the mysticism of the Jewish Kabbalah through the circle discussed above. Both Lessing and Jacobi would have encountered Moore and Van Helmont through the publication of von Rosenholz's Kabbalah Denudata. The pantheism controversy would initiate a remarkable revival of Spinocism that influenced German thought from Hegel to at least Nietzsche, if not Heidegger and Benjamin. In fact, one could say that the soi-disant classical German philosophy of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel is inconceivable without the Spinozan Renaissance. On July the 6th, 1780, Jacobi reports Lessing's rejection of the orthodox concept of the Godhead. I can no longer relish it. Hen kai pan, I know no other. The Greek tag, hen kai pan, became the rallying call of the pantheism controversy. It was taken from the 1733 Latin translation of Rafe Cudworth's The True Intellectual System of the Universe, in which we find the precise wording used by Jacobi in the controversy, to hen kai pan, unum et omnem. In The True Intellectual System of 1678, one discovers hen to pan, one all. This, via Johann Lorenz Mosheim's paraphrase of Cudworth, hen kai pan became the call to arms of the German idealists. Mosheim, his dates are 1693 to 1755, the so-called Erasmus of the 18th century, played a key role in the transmission of the Cambridge Platonists on the European continent, especially in Germany. Mosheim's translation of Cudworth, with its extensive critical notes, became a textbook in German universities, especially Tübingen and in Jena, which were key in the emergence of German idealism and romanticism. Cudworth's Systema Intellectuale Huius Universi in 2 large volumes, and in 1773 there was a second edition, and this was reviewed by Friedrich Nicolai in the influential Allgemeine Deutsche Bibliothek. Now, it's worth remembering that the German idealists were trained as theologians and as classicists, and that the Mosheim-Cudworth edition of the True Intellectual System assumes much greater significance once one realizes the importance of the patristic theological legacy in 18th century German thought. Lessing, for example, the man posthumously at the heart of the Pantheismusstreit, as well as a poet, philosopher, and general man of letters, was a particularly learned theologian. So I will leave you with that as a narrative about the influence of the Cambridge Platonists on the emergence of idealistic and romantic philosophy, and I think that's a narrative that is less well known than it should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Douglas, for your very informative talk. It's fascinating to follow your thinking throughout the talk and to follow along with all of these ways in which the Cambridge Platonists were deeply influential. I'll open the floor first for any questions, and if there are not, then I will take the liberty as moderator to ask questions. Let me see also if there's anything on YouTube. Okay, maybe I will begin. So thank you very much for the talk. I'm very interested in the influence of Cudsworth and the Cambridge Platonists on German idealism. And I'm fascinated by this link via the Henkaipan, the one and all, which is one of the central, if not the central motifs of the German idealist tradition. And I would like to hear more about Cudsworth's concept of the one and all. Because within the German idealist tradition, one way that Schelling, for example, in his Freedom essay, discusses the one and all of Spinoza is that Spinoza is a great philosopher, but the problem is that his one and all isn't free. You know, this is not a free one and all. And so part of the task of German idealism is in a way to liberate the one and all and to give it the form of freedom. And I'm interested in how the one and all, as it appears in Cudsworth, what's the form of this one and all? You had briefly indicated some of these, that there's a true intellectual system, everything's united and joined, there's order and coherence. There's also kind of an indication that there's this concept of the monad perhaps there as well. So I would be very interested to learn more about the content of this one and all in Cudsworth himself.
Well, I think the first point I think is to make about the notion of system. So that is in the philosophical context, it would seem that Cudsworth is the first major philosopher to use system in a philosophical sense. So prior to Cudsworth, the word was used in terms of cosmology and in terms of politics, but not in the radical philosophical sense in which Cudsworth is using it. So Thomas Hanke at the University of Frankfurt, and I think he's going to be moving to the University of Münster. He has worked on this, and this seems to be the case, that Cudsworth is decisive because of this usage of the term system. And as you know, that's absolutely key for the German idealists. In fact, if you could say that German idealism is the attempt to find a system of freedom, Jacobi is insistent that this is a contradiction in terms, and that in fact Spinoza is the example of how, you know, once you follow a genuinely systematic form of philosophizing, then that this leads to nihilism. But of course, in some respects, and some critics have said this, that, you know, that the term the Cambridge Platonist is rather misleading. Sometimes that's based on an anachronistic conception of what Platonism is. The Platonism of the Cambridge Platonists is deeply Origenistic. So their favorite church father is Origen. And at the heart of their Origenism is the insistence upon freedom. And of course, this is partly to do with their critique of Augustinianism, and particularly the predestinarianism of the later Augustine. And so Origen becomes a model of a philosopher, theologian who is advocating a system of radical freedom. And that's exactly what the true intellectual system is about. It's giving a model of the universe in opposition to the materialistic accounts that were flourishing in the 17th century. Obviously, Hobbes was the major figure, and it's in a sense a version of the argument that you find in Book 10 of the Laws in Plato. and the claim that naturalistic, deterministic materialism of the Hobbesian model kind is inadequate, because there must be a intellectual, as Cudworth says, mind senior to the world, which is the principle of both individual freedom and indeed of providence. So that's the overarching system that Cudworth is arguing for in the first volume of his True Intellectual System, which remained the first volume. He never published any subsequent volumes.
I see. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. And it's motivating to go back and actually look at Cudworth himself as a scholar of German idealism. It's motivating. Earlier, we had heard a talk from Dermot Moran, and we discussed the influence of Neo-Platonic thinking on the Hegelian tradition, and the German idealist tradition in general. And this is another trajectory to follow up on.
Yeah. Well, I met Dermot first at the in the seminar of Werner Bayerwalters, and I think in many ways I mean, I'm still a very a great admirer of my Doktorvater, and in fact I've recently written an article called "The Yearning for Transcendence," which is coming out it's come out in the Journal of Neoplatonic Studies, about the thought of Werner Bayerwalters. And one, if as it were, I could make a contribution to an aspect of Bayerwalter's thought that is missing, it would be precisely this, because it's not clear from the monumental works of Bayerwalters about Platonismus and Idealismus how, in a way, you get from the Renaissance tradition, let's even include Nicholas of Cusa, who was probably Werner's favorite philosopher apart from Plotinus, but certainly Ficino and the other Renaissance figures. How do you get from them to the German idealists? Because if you look in the sources, the actual direct Neoplatonic sources in Hegel or Schelling, there's not that much. And of course, this was the criticism of Bayerwalters by those in the Jena project in Munich, and they were saying, well, it's all right for Bayerwalters to say that there's this link between Platonism and idealism, but where's the evidence? Now, I think that through seeing the reception of the Cambridge Platonists, there you can see it. So, of course, this is Neoplatonism, but it's coming through the reception of Boehm, it's coming through the reception of the Kabbalah, it's coming through a reception of Spinoza that is actually transforming Spinoza. So even the Spinoza that is being discussed is not the Spinoza of the ethics. It's a sort of Neoplatonized Spinoza. So I think, in a way, what I'm talking about is a sort of contribution to a debate that of which Werner Bayerwalters was a very significant part.
Perfect. I'm glad that we can end on a theme that connects with the very first talk of the day. Steve, you also said that you had a question, but it's not related to the talk per se, but to the book on Coleridge. I thought, since we have Douglas here, you could ask your question.
Yes, thanks, Greg. And thank you, Professor Headley, for the interesting talk. I don't know a whole lot about the Cambridge Platonists, so I listened with interest and found your sharing to be quite informative in many ways. Of course, I know something about the pantheism controversy because of Kant's skill in pretending like he was avoiding it. which I don't think he did as much as he made people think that he did. I've written a paper arguing that the best way to interpret Kant is as a panentheist, which is too controversial to get into right now. But my question is simply one of fact, actually, because I read some time ago, and it's so long ago that I don't even remember where I read it, that Coleridge actually at least began working on a translation of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason into English. And I'm just wondering, since you have a book on Coleridge, whether you know anything about that, and if you do, you know if he finished the translation, or did he even start it, or was it just something that he was working on? And I apologize for asking a question that's not related to your talk.
No. I mean, that's a very interesting question, and frankly, I can't give you an accurate answer. And as you know, the sort of things you work on as a doctoral student, they sort of often stick with you, and you return to these areas, but sometimes without knowledge of the sort of latest scholarship in the area. So I'm not 100% certain about what I'm going to say as an answer, but it's basically this, that Coleridge, I think, had an astonishing knowledge of German. He was, of course, an expert and brilliant linguist. His training at Christ's Hospital as a boy and at Cambridge was a primarily philological training. And I think you see that in the way that he picked up German very quickly while he was in Göttingen. And I noticed that René Welleck would criticize Coleridge's translations or use of German. And these criticisms were often rather pettifogging, where I thought actually the Coleridge translation was rather better than Welleck's in some respect. Obviously, Welleck, I think, was bilingual, but he was probably knew both Czech and German. But he, technically Welleck would be right, but in terms of the spirit, you could see exactly what Coleridge was up to. So here was a linguistic genius. He was a writer and thinker of brilliance, who was reading Kant, and I doubt that he was produced a translation of or even, I mean, he may have begun it, but I certainly didn't get very far with it. But what he did is definitely he read Kant very carefully, and was capable of reading him with great insight, as very few people were in the English-speaking world at the time. And of course, that's one reason why figures like, in part of this legacy of the Cambridge Platonists that I was talking about earlier, one has to consider Emerson and the American transcendentalists, and they are deeply dependent on Coleridge. And part of it is because of Coleridge's philological and philosophical capacities. Incidentally, in Cambridge, there was a whole school of young philosophers who were anti-empiricists, and the philosophy in Cambridge is called to this day it's called the moral science tripos, and the moral sciences, so the degree in philosophy in Cambridge, was founded by a group of Coleridgians who were basically influenced by Kant and Coleridge. And Mill, in his essay, John Stuart Mill, in his essay on Bentham and Coleridge, he says that all Victorians in Britain are either of the Germano-Coleridgian party or they're Benthamites, i.e. utilitarian empiricists. That is, he's writing in the wake of these figures in Cambridge in particular, which included very significant philosophers of science like William Whewell in Cambridge, who were sort of Kantians through Coleridge's influence. So I would say, contrary to the aspersions of figures like Welleck, Coleridge, he had the equipment to really transmit Kantian ideas into England and America in the 19th century. There's one other figure that I'll mention just in passing. That's Richard Owen. So when Darwin, produced his great work, we forget that the most vigorous critique of Darwin didn't come from the theologians. In fact, Charles Kingsley, another Coleridgian, was rather positive about Darwin. The most vigorous critique came from Richard Owen, who was the most eminent naturalist in England. And Owen was a friend of Whewell and a sort of Coleridgian. And his argument against Darwin was that if you look at the species and look at the vertebrate structures among various different species, you have to posit something like archetypes. Because why is it that all these species that are biologically unrelated to each other have the same, as it were, body form, the same body shape, along this vertebrate structure? So now this is coming out of a reading of the ideas in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. So in the later part of the Critique of Pure Reason and the doctrine of the regulative ideas of reason in the dialectic, and Coleridge's interpretation of that, and then Coleridge's claim that, well, basically as a philosopher, you've got the option: either you take those ideas to be regulative, as Kant says, or you say they're constitutive, like Plato and Plotinus. And so anyway, in this way, this sort of Coleridge was very important for this reception of Kant, certainly in Cambridge in the UK, and indeed Cambridge in the US.
If I could just follow on that really quick, by asking a personal question, I noticed from your biography online that you went to Keble College.
I did, yeah.
But it didn't say the years. Were you there in the or were you there in the mid 80s by any chance?
I was. So I was at Keble from 1981 to 1985.
Oh, okay, interesting. Those were the years I did my doctorate at Oxford, and somewhere in those years, I think it was around 83 to 84, I spent quite a lot of time in the Keble College library,
Nice.
partly because it was so nice.
Yes,
and
yes.
At least at that time, they would allow. I don't know if actually I was allowed to go in, but anyway, I did go in.
And admitting this now in front of the world, Steve.
Right, but I'm mentioning this simply because what I was doing in the different college libraries at Oxford was looking for any translations of Kant that were rare or unusual. And at Keble College Library, I found a 1799 translation of 19 works of Kant
Wow.
by that was translated anonymously. Although I did some detective work, I won't go into how I did this now, but I discovered that it was done by an Englishman by the name of John Richardson, who had spent quite a lot of time in Germany. And I'm not
Yep.
sure, but I wonder, he did not translate the first critique, but I've always wondered whether perhaps John Richardson knew Coleridge in some way, and whether his reason for not translating any of the first critique might have been that perhaps he knew that Coleridge was working on it or
Right.
something. Anyway, but yeah, we may well have sat together in the
Funny, yes.
Keble College Library if you ever.
Oh, it was, yes, yes.
Just a funny little biographical note, but it relates to my question because my greatest find, I've never seen another copy of that book. Although I think the Bodleian had it, but it was not, you couldn't borrow it. But I was able to take that book out of Keble College Library, 1799 original edition, and photocopy the whole thing. So it was just an amazing find for me. So
Right.
anyway, just a little tidbit. Anyway, thanks, Greg, for allowing me to ask that completely unrelated question.
Very good. Okay. Thanks again, Douglas Headley, for your talk, and thanks for answering the questions and for the discussion. There's a lot for us to think about here going into the next few days.
And well, thank you very much. I have to leave, I'm afraid, because I'm teaching today. It's in the middle of our teaching term, so I'll have to say goodbye. But thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thanks so much. Have a good day. Good luck teaching.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. So this concludes the conference for the first day, and we'll pick up again tomorrow with J.C. Bale's talk, 10 Objections to Contradictory Theology. So thanks everybody for attending, for your questions, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.